Good evening. I'd like to call our special council meeting from Monday, August 23rd to order. Hello to members of the public who are watching the live webcast or to those watching a recording after the meeting. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we're holding this evening's meeting in the territory of the Wasanish Nations, and we'll turn to approval of the agenda. I would like to state that, that tonight's agenda has arisen because as mayor, I am under section 131 of the community charter. I am bringing forward to council to reconsider and vote again on a matter within 30 days. And it was a meeting from a meeting on our July 19th agenda, whereby we voted on a matter with regards to a variance request from an applicant. And after we defeated that resolution, and a subsequent resolution, we did not close the variance application. And so the application remained open. The applicant was free to bring forward a request, and they have done so. While we have voted on a motion arising, we have not voted on a specific request from the applicant with information provided to by the applicant. And so thus it appears as item 5A on our agenda this evening, and we will have a presentation before that. So it will be a live motion on the floor when we come to that agenda item after the presentation. And with that, I would seek a motion to approve, please.
Move approval.
Second.
All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. And we do have a presentation this evening from Christopher Biersgaard of Small Gods Brewing. I'll ask Ms. Nelson to confirm connection.
Hi, Chris. Are you connected?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. The mayor will just introduce the item then.
Good evening, Mr. Biersgaard. We appreciate your making a presentation to council this evening on the development variance permit application number DV 100308 at 9837 3rd Street, Small Gods Brewing, to reduce payment in lieu amount to $10,000 per parking space. You have the floor for up to 10 minutes, and we'd be pleased if you would take any questions that council members may have after.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'd like to start by saying I was confused when I put this offer forward, as I didn't think the payment in lieu price of $10,000 per stall was rejected, but instead that Councillor Rintoul's attempt to negotiate on my behalf was rejected. With that in mind, I would also like to say that I'm flexible on increasing the payment in lieu number over $10,000 per stall. Now, that said, even at $10,000 per stall, I don't really know, and I still have no idea where I'm going to get this money as of today. That is why I wish to add a second request to council, and that I am given 2 years grace to pay the payment in lieu fee. 20% of businesses fail in their first 2 years of operation, and often due to unforeseen costs in the startup phase that they never recover from. Giving me 2 years grace on the payment in lieu fee will give my business a fighting chance to survive. If I don't make it, the financial burden of this variance fee will fall on my landlord, more than likely resulting in the 4 parking stalls being restored, as I can't see them wanting to pay that fee. If I do make it, the fee will hit me at a time of profitability, and I'll have had time to prepare for it. I hope that the court of public opinion can be the decider of my fate in this case. If the town feels my business has placed too much a burden on the town's parking, they won't support me and I'll fail. Or if they decide I bring something positive to the town, then I'll make it to my 2nd anniversary where I'll be in a position to pay the variance. I'm not asking for a free ride. I'm simply asking to not, have the hand on the throat of my dreams while it's still in the crib. I'm trying to, work with this town as best I can. And so with that in mind, I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Biersgaard. I do have a question. I will just start off before turning to colleagues. And that is, it has been presented in the staff report this evening, and perhaps you can provide clarification that for council's consideration to allow the payment in lieu of parking fees to be paid over a 12-month period, and we understand that that request wouldn't have come from yourself. From what I've just heard, is that still the case, or are you altering that?
So I am altering it to 2 years with the understanding that as when I put this first in, I was under the understanding that the motion wasn't defeated for 10,000 payment in lieu. And basically anything over and above, like I still didn't even know where I was going to get that money, to be quite frank, which is why I tried to build in a payment schedule as is. But there's maybe going to be a number that the council feels is appropriate tonight that is above that number. And the more it goes up, the less likely, I have a chance to survive. So my request in trying to come up with reasonable solutions is to delay the payment 2 years, because that puts me into a profitability state where I'm not panicking trying to find the money. And if a mistake happens that's out of my control, like the delay in our liquor license, that can cost me time, which can cost me money. And so I'm just doing my best to mitigate these problems, reduce the upfront cost that'll keep me from making this business possible, and pushing that into a timeline that's one where I'm in profitability or not in existence, and then the parking spaces are returned.
Okay, well, thank you for the clarification on that aspect of the request. I'll turn to any colleagues if they have any questions. Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Mayor. And this question actually threw you to staff, and that's about our ability to provide a business a payment scheme over a period longer than 12 months. Is that something we can do? I thought there was a prohibition about assisting business.
Through the mayor to Councillor Wainwright, there is one precedent I'm aware of for taking installments for a parking variance. That approval was done before I started with the town, but I was here for the tail end of it. My perspective on this one is that it's a bit of a unique situation because it might not be a permanent loss of parking spaces, as the applicant has said, and that there is a chance that if the business moves or fails, that we get the spots back. So on that basis, I would be supportive of looking at a payment plan as long as an agreement was put in place to ensure we got payment. Because frankly, once we issue the permit, we lose some of our ability to collect. So it would have to be a pretty good agreement, and I believe it's doable.
Councillor Wainwright.
So a supplementary question then. Could the payment term be longer than 2 years?
I'm afraid I don't know the exact legal limitations, if there are any. All I know is that the one that was previously approved about 20 years ago was longer than 2 years.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Thanks for the information. A few things I'm wondering about is, so when you were preparing your business case for this venture, you knew that the minimum amount you would have to pay for pay in lieu was $10,000. So I would have thought, did you not factor into your business plan, so that you knew right off the bat that four spots at $10,000 would be $40,000? So I'm wondering why you wouldn't have factored into your original business planning and your budget.
Unfortunately, it wasn't a foreseen cost when I was doing the plan, or even up until the point in which I signed a lease, well, not the lease, the conditional lease. That being is I did do my due diligence on the town, and what my ability to open a business, specifically a brewery in the town, is made sure that the zoning was correct, commercial zoning, all reflected. The difficult thing is, because it's a unique situation, I delved into the legalities around zoning and how much space I can use in a garage. I didn't look at the developer variance fees, because I'm not a developer. I don't build buildings, I occupy them. So it was a unique situation where I made the mistake, I missed it, but it was tough for me to go looking at every single angle to go, okay, well, what if I'm treated as a developer and not a brewer?
Okay. I guess what I'm wondering is, presumably when you embarked on this, it sounds like you're needing those spots for your production, and you need shipping and receiving. And so when you looked at this particular facility, there's no shipping and receiving there. Why did you, if this didn't meet your needs in terms of shipping and receiving and production facility, why did you choose that location and not consider something else that might be more suited to what the needs for a brewery might be?
I suppose it was because, I mean, in the plans for the business as it was developed, like as I looked at the developer's sell documents, everything related to it, there was a brew pub in that space, and the downtown zoning is acceptable for brew pubs. So even though, initially I also wasn't aware the upper deck was public parking, which definitely reduced my ability to do a loading area up there, as I would be taking away public parking, which I knew would be unacceptable. So it was one of those trying to find a solution to a problem, because it's like this business is zoned for here, implying that the business is welcomed here, and that breweries are unique in that they are, kind of hybrid, commercial, light industrial. So no matter where you go, you're not going to find a perfect example. If I went to a purely industrial or light industrial area, my ability to operate a tasting room would be severely reduced. Unfortunately, frankly, it's a unique and somewhat frustrating part of this business when you're in your startup phase is unless you buy the land and build the building yourself, there's no perfect solution.
So when you were dealing with your potential new landlord, and you communicated that you were going to need some space, did he, is he offering any support? At what point did you realize that pay in lieu was a factor for you?
Unfortunately, a little too late, where I get in a tough situation. See, the problem when you start a brewery is because of the licensing process, and then also how long it takes to engineer, build, and do everything. To be able to do it without running out of money, simply just paying for an empty space while you do this process we're currently in, requires you to kind of go on a little bit of blind faith. So I'm now stuck in a tough position. Lose my deposit on my equipment, and lose the engineering architectural fees that I've already invested, which are quite significant as well, to then move it. And I found that out with the payment in lieu factor. And it's one of those, well, if you just go and pay the payment in lieu, at what point do these things make you run out of money? So I have a financial obligation to myself and my partner to try and fight this as best I can, or find a solution to this as best I can, because the alternative is also kind of financially devastating. So it's not a situation where I was trying to, get one over on anybody. It just kind of resulted in a bad space for me.
And I guess just one more question, if I may, just to finish off. So, it sounds like you got into this situation. You maybe, as you say, maybe it was your mistake that you didn't research maybe as much as you should in terms of the pay in lieu. I'll also just a comment in terms of
I might just interrupt, Councillor, with regards to comments. If you have questions of the proponent.
Okay, so my question is, so now that you're in this situation, are you looking possibly at scaling back? So the facility that you're proposing, I think it seats 165 people, which is significant. And so are you looking at perhaps scaling back the operation, that something that would be more manageable?
I would say that's not a financially possible thing for two reasons. That seating capacity is total human beings in the building, and a brewery requires minimum by government standard 14 employees at all times. We're going to operate probably around a 20 employee base, maybe not all of them in the building at the exact same time. And you have to also account for coming and going of people who may be getting a sandwich to go or a quick beer. So it's not like all the seats are actually being used, as well as a large number of those seats, almost half, are outdoor seats. So they're not guaranteed year round. And they're not to do with my lease. Like, they come with the lease, but it's not what the government is concerned about when you are making a manufacturing space. So in order to reduce it, we'd end up in a financially unviable position.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to Councillor Rentoul and to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Christopher, you may have just answered my question. First off, very challenging, I think, to start up any business, and it's a challenging time to do so. And so, good on you on your persistence to try and follow this dream and put it together. And I wish you well with your endeavor. My question was along the lines of whether or not you've contemplated revisiting your plan to use these parking spaces for part of your operational requirements, and maybe, despite the fact you've just commented on it to Councillor Keith's question, you could help educate us further to the information you provided about why it's necessary to use that space, or whether or not you can plan the space a little differently if this doesn't go the way you're hoping to. So if you could comment on that, please, Christopher.
Yes. So the other big challenge with a business like this, especially one that is below residential spaces, is you want to try and limit the impact on the public parking coming and going, as well as any adverse smells or parts of the manufacturing process that someone sitting on their balcony may be exposed to. So the other logic to this, the reason why I was excited about this idea and this plan, wasn't just a financial situation. It was also because the hours a brewery operates would not conflict with the coming and going of a standard residential parking lot. Basically, when we're doing the stuff we're doing, everybody's either out for the day or the car's already parked. We're not going to mess up their lives that way. And by removing that traffic and putting it down to the basement, we, will lessen the burden on the public scale of parking in the town, as well as by doing the grain out through the floor into the sealed bin. We've taken what is a relative risk of someone smelling some old stinky grain that a farmer couldn't pick up for whatever reason on a day, just sitting out on the public parking pad, and moving it down to the basement in the sealed bin where it could sit for days and days and days and nobody would notice. Because it's not taking up a public parking spot, so there's no physical barrier to it. And there's no risk of, that sealed bin if it's then in a sealed room that's ventilated, of course, but like you're adding the barriers of olfactory, kind of barriers there. So for us, it was like, okay, there's those elements. And then there's also a structural engineering element where the equipment that I'm moving down there, specifically 2 large tanks of stainless steel that contain beer, and then we'll put kegs in it and put those to the side. And that's kind of how we rotate the beer through out of the brewing process into the serving process. Those are it represents about 48,000 pounds worth of stuff when wet. So even though we've done our structural engineering and everything's fine, it was a way to really reduce that risk and make sure that we could have the most operational volume that we could to counteract the financial issues that you have around sorry, my wife's writing a note. Yeah, I understand that as well. Around the weight of the bill of the equipment, you can lessen the concerns about the structural engineering by moving it downstairs. I've seen a brewery in Calgary that got built. People didn't do their due diligence, and suddenly they're only able to fill one of their X number of tanks at any given time because of the wet weight and someone didn't do the engineering correctly. So, and then finally, if it was just a matter of leasing more space is the equivalent of a $250,000 swing over the first 10 years of our lease. Could be even more on the renewals, depending on where the real estate in Sydney goes in terms of that. So, it's a rock and a hard place on a lot of things. There's a lot of reasons why that made sense.
Okay, thank you. I think that helps.
Thank you, Councillor Garner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Beersgard, for taking questions. This is more of a small technical thing, but I'm looking at your Small Gods Brewing request for support. I'm assuming that came right off from an online or website or something like that?
Which one? Is it the BIA?
Yeah. I'm not sure if
So
it's yours.
the BIA,
The BIA did this one?
yes, I work directly with the BIA. So they have a letter that's endorsing me, as well as they have a letter that has a list of businesses. And the BIA directly went out to those businesses to seek our support on our behalf.
I just said I noticed in there, you might want to contact them. They've given an incorrect address on here with regards to your proposal. They've got 2835 as opposed to 9835. So
Okay.
that if somebody wanted to be stickler, they could say that makes these invalid because they're not up to the proper address, just so you're aware. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further questions from colleagues? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Beersgard, for your presentation and for taking our questions this evening. And we'll be coming to the item shortly.
So thank you very much.
So that concludes the presentation, and we'll turn to item 5A, which is this same development variance application, number DV 100308. And the motion that we are considering, that is now on the floor, that owners and tenants in occupation of property within 100 meters, 328 feet of 9837 3rd Street be notified regarding development variance application number DV 100308 to reduce payment in lieu fees to $10,000 per space for 4 spaces, and that any written correspondence received be forwarded to council at the time of consideration of approval of the variance. I would first ask council members if they have any questions of staff based on the staff report submitted, and if not, we can go into deliberation on the motion. Seeing no questions, the motion is on the floor. Councillor Rentoul.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And so council will recollect that, I was comfortable with seeing this as an alternative to pay in lieu on the basis that our bylaw had just been amended at the same meeting in which we had addressed this. And so I had felt that for the applicant, for their planning purposes, although we've addressed that this evening to an extent, that it would have been far more challenging, obviously, to have been somewhat caught off guard by this this change in pay in lieu, and appreciating that the individual is starting a new business with a number of challenges, given the nature of the business, that I'm continue to be comfortable to support the reduction in pay in lieu to $10,000. The only other comment I'll make, if I may, Mr. Mayor, part of my comfort level with this, in seeing it go out for further consultation, is in fact the support that is in the package from the business community. And I will confess it surprised me somewhat. I have been very much of the opinion and heard from businesses that parking is a challenge in our community. No matter how you look at it, this is for parking spots that aren't going to be utilized for parking, which means those vehicles will be elsewhere, I'm assuming on the street. So having that level of concern myself, I think the report, including the support from local businesses to see this move forward as suggested, is frankly somewhat reassuring, if not surprising. And so I will support the motion for the reduction in pay in lieu. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I'm not in favor of supporting the motion for a number of reasons. So I think it's important for the community, business community especially, to know that this is a facility that's has the capacity for 165 people, and there will be no parking provided for the customers. I'm also surprised that the SBIA members supported this, because they're the ones that I hear from the most that complain about lack of parking downtown. And I wonder, when I looked at the correspondence that went out to their members, I wonder whether they fully understood what was being asked for here, because it was very vague in terms of, please support this young business with the pay in lieu. But I don't really think that they had the full information. As I say, 165 person operation with no parking. You know, I'm also concerned about the fact that this building was supposed to have 120 parking spaces in the first place. They got a variance and one pay in lieu. I don't necessarily agree with the interpretation that this building should still get a pay in lieu, but I realize there's nothing that we can do about that now, but I think it's something we have to change. In regards to the comments that the 4 spaces were not going to be available for public use anyways, as Councillor Rintoul pointed out, those 4 spaces could have been used by people in that building. And there's a domino effect. Now, we've seen that already in some of the letters that we've received. People who are living in that building are trying to get a parking space and they can't. And so guess what? They're using street and public parking. So that is a concern. Another concern for me is the applicant's business case in the first place. And so I would have thought someone starting out a business in the town would have done a bit more research and due diligence. So they should have known right off the bat that they're on the hook for $10,000 for 4 parking spaces. So coming up with $40,000 for pay in lieu should have been part of their original business plan. And they should have, so it's difficult for me to overlook that, because I think that's a basic thing that they should have been able to find out. In terms of the fact that, you know, this 20,000 pay in lieu came out of the blue, they only knew about it 10 minutes before on our agenda. The issue of council increasing pay in lieu was well known, well, should have been. It was out in the public. It had been for 2 years. When we first started talking about this, and it's in our minutes in September 2019 was the first time that our council said we wanted to increase pay in lieu. It was in our strategic plan for 2020. So anybody looking at our strategic plan, doing their due diligence about setting up business in Sydney, would have seen a number of concerns there about parking, and one of them was about reviewing the amount for pay in lieu. We talked about it at 2 meetings in the month of October, Committee of the Whole and Council, providing direction to staff to increase the pay in lieu. So there's another 2 instances. We talked about it again in May, when we talked again about increasing pay in lieu, again on June 14th and June 28th, where we had first, second, and third readings to increase the pay in lieu to 20,000. So I think it's important for the public and the business community to know that this is not something that council just pulled out of their back pocket 15 minutes before the individual made their presentation. This was something that was out in the public domain, in the community. The chamber knew about it, the SBIA knew about it, and never made any submissions to council to say this wasn't a good thing. I guess, you know, the other things that I'm concerned about is that the reason that we made the decision to increase pay in lieu was to discourage business owners from skimping on parking or using it for other uses. And so, as I said the first time around, I'm concerned that we're going to relent on that on the first case we get. I'm worried that we're setting a precedent for businesses to come forward and say, sorry, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about pay in lieu. I didn't factor it into my calculations. And this is going to have a bad impact on my business financially. And so council should relent and not do this. So I think it's a dangerous precedent to set that we're not going to follow through on our commitments. And I think it's something that was foreseeable. So for those reasons, yeah, I won't support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Mayor. So, the issue I've had with this request for the development variance permit, or the variance on the payment in lieu, is with the development, not with this particular business. And in fact, Sydney does not have a brew pub, and it would definitely be an attraction. I'm not surprised that quite a lot of the business community considers that it would be an attraction and is supportive of it. And I think I even mentioned in the previous meeting when this first came forward that if it was any other building in Sydney that they were requesting the variance for, I would not have this objection in principle, right? So if they were asking for the same thing in the building across the street, I'd be inclined to support it, which is making me struggle a bit with this. I appreciate the case that the proponents made, and obviously done his due diligence, quite a bit of investment in the location, the license process, conditional lease and all that. And I'm really not comfortable sending a message that a new business isn't welcome in Sydney. Although, this is not a case of the business not being welcome. It's a case of giving that particular development yet another variance with respect to parking. And this is where the idea of the payments actually became a bit attractive, because if it was a 2-year payment scheme, and if the majority of the money was, if it was more than a 2-year, if the majority of the money was still outstanding, like, I guess if they pay up front and they, say it was the full 20,000, they pay up front, and then there's yet another 4 parking spaces short, the business fails, and the development is now left with a windfall of 4, payment in lieu, right? But if the money is still outstanding at the end of a couple of years, payment still owing, and the business goes under, there's no windfall for the development. It's either put the spaces back or pay the money. That is much more appealing, I have to say. I'm finding myself not wanting to make a hasty decision tonight, and what I'm thinking about is that if we advertise for the variance, I've got a couple more weeks to think this through, and I'll also see what people think. I think I'm going to be voting for the advertising the variance. That doesn't say I'm going to vote in favor at the end, but I'm willing to put it out and let people comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. I'll turn to Councillor Garnett and then to Councillor Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to thank my other colleagues for their comments, all very good and very thoughtful. Through discussion with staff on Friday, got some good clarity, lots of questions were answered, and basically, if for some reason they were able to come up with $80,000 and we defeated this motion, they can do it without us. So that's what I've been told would happen. They can just pay it and it's a done deal. So for me, I will support the recommendation. And my prior main reason for doing so is that I want to hear what the public has to say, because I think that's an important part of the conversation. And their say will mean a lot in how I make my decision. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I know I asked this at the last time we discussed this, but I think it's probably important if this is going to go out to the public again to clarify, because Councillor O'Keefe just made this statement again, that these are spaces that the public cannot use. And I'm going to put this question forward through to staff again to clarify that these spaces were never public spaces. They were in fact commercial spaces that the landlord had the discretion to give out to tenants. That in no way is parking being taken from the public, and that we have received letters from the public saying they could not find spaces for their second car, which was never part of the agreement for residences in this building. They got one space. I think it was actually, if I had to look it up again, 0.6 per condo. So taking away these 4 spaces, which were meant for the commercial developments, is in no way impacting the residents from getting a second spot or a original spot for their car. So my question through to staff is, can you confirm that these spaces were not public spaces for me?
Through the mayor to Councillor Duncan. So these spaces are behind a secure parking gate. And I would assume, as a result, not accessible to a member of the public not associated with that building. Potentially, I guess, a resident of the building could let a friend in or something like that, but they would need a fob to access the gate. And yeah, so it's not general customer parking. It's secured underground parking, only accessible to residents or tenants of the building.
Okay, so I might have to, well, I would have to go back and look at the last one, but I was certain that in the last time he presented, he made clear that these were part of a parcel, like 2 of these spaces are his. Full stop, they belong to this business. That for sure.
Again, through the mayor to Councillor Duncan, the landlord of the building has full control of those spaces, and they may allocate them in any way they wish. The town does not have control over that. The landlord may have made an agreement of some kind to provide those spaces to the tenant. Mm-hmm. That's an agreement between the tenant and the landlord, and if that's the case, that's the case, but that's not something that the parking bylaw has any jurisdiction over at this point.
Yeah, thank you. What I meant is that, yes, from our last agenda, 2 of these spaces were the spaces that, per agreement with the landlord and any commercial business moving into this space, they got 2 for their employees. So what he did was purchased from the landlord 2 additional spaces in order to put this in. And those 2 additional spaces may be secure, may have been residents, but my recollection was that they were not possibly going to be part of the residence, but I'll let that one go. Perhaps those 2 are. But in more likelihood, it was going to be part of what was available for the commercial businesses. So I think this is really going to be important, that people are going to write letters and they may have very strong opinions about those spaces and how they are impacting them. And we're going to actually need to be careful as council that we go back and are really clear on whether or not that's true, regardless of what their perception of how this is impacting their parking is. And the second thing I think we should be really clear on, and some of the way Councillor Wainwright has phrased this alarms me, considering some of the issues we've had with previous businesses in town, and how we've interpreted our own bylaws, is that the payment in lieu is for when we have a developer coming in and we're trying to make sure that they don't skimp on parking. It's not for when a business, because businesses are not usually developers and then they build their own building, as the applicant has suggested. He's not building from scratch, he's merely a tenant. So it does make sense that he did not consider himself a developer who would be under the same requirements, because he's not building these spots, he's leasing them. And so I think we need to be clear that if we're talking about how we are applying our bylaws to a business based on which business it goes into, or which building it goes into based on a past history with a developer, which is no longer in the picture. It is a different landlord, it is a different business. And it's concerning to me that we would say we would make a decision on how the business will be treated based on the past history with a developer and on the decision of whether they were building something and providing it in the first place versus whether somebody is going to, how somebody is going to choose to use that space once it is being leased. And I think we need to be really careful when we start trying to make that decision based on that, especially when payment in lieu is, it's not something the town is making money from. This isn't going into our coffers. They are not depriving the town of resources. This was it's a discouragement. It is punitive towards the developers to discourage them from trying to skimp on parking and save money that way. It's not something we use to earn money for town services. And so to deliberately apply something that is meant to be punitive towards a developer to a new business because we don't like how it shook out with the developer, I think that's the dangerous precedent. And I want to be really careful as we go forward that we think about how that's going to look for new businesses that come in and for landlords who are going to want to be managing these commercial spaces. And remember, people are going to be paying attention and comparing us to other municipalities and how they were welcomed. So that's what I got to say about that.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'll turn to Councillor Fallot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to carry on with the theme that Councillor Duncan was just on regarding the parking spots and how they're used and public, I'm going to disagree. The parking spots are not public spots, so the public isn't going to come in and use them. But the parking spots were designed to be used by a tenant, an occupant of the building. That occupant is not going to be using that parking spot, then they're going to go out onto the street. So I think it was Councillor O'Keefe that talked about the domino effect. It pushes it on. So it isn't a direct loss, it is an indirect loss, but I think it does impact the amount of public space that is available. The second part is we don't say to a developer, you need to provide X amount of square feet of extra space. It can be used as parking, or it can be used as storage or manufacture or something like that. That's up to your discretion. We calculate in, when we're looking at the square feet that's being developed, that a certain amount of space is allocated to parking. Now we're taking away that parking and using it for manufacturing and storage rather than parking. So I understand the way that the bylaw reads, that's not our issue. But I do have a problem when a business is basing its plan on spreading out its square footage into something that was designed for a different purpose. So in this case, it's high real estate, that this is a brand new building and it's expensive building. The square footage is prime. It's unfortunate that there is a struggle, a challenge to find the right place within the town that is effective for walk by and the type of customer that is being sought for this, and still be able to find a place that they can manufacture and sell their product and create an ambiance. I get there's a struggle there. Unfortunately, this is prime real estate, and it is what it is. Should the applicant have been aware of our payment in lieu costs and whatnot? Well, you know, it is what it is. They didn't calculate it in. I think it's something that should have been part of their due diligence, wherever they got their information or how they gathered it and made their decision. Fair enough, it is what it is. I don't believe that giving up these parking spots, granting this variance, for the manufacturing and the storage is the best plan. So I'm not going to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fallett. Having heard from all other members of council, I'll take a moment to speak, and I'd like to speak with regards to on several points. First off, I'll say that I am supporting the motion because I would like to hear from the public on this, as other colleagues have indicated. But I would like to address some of the comments that have made in some of the information we received in the presentation. And the first is with regards to whether or not the proponent factored in the $10,000 parking in lieu into his business plan. And it's actually not part of my decision criteria. While I appreciate the questions that arose from colleagues and that the proponent indicated that they had not factored it in, the request is to pay $10,000, and they're prepared to do that. So it's not whether or not they factored the $10,000 into the business plan. Today, they are willing to pay the $10,000. So I'm not, I don't think the aspect with regards to whether or not it was factored into the business plan is material to my decision on this. I want to clarify the number of parking spaces. The number of 165 has been mentioned. It's been in reports. If we look at the drawings that is in our appendices, there is 145 seats in the restaurant. And if the equipment that is moved to the basement under the current floor plan, so the floor plan we have is with this equipment that is proposed to go into the basement is actually sited on the ground floor level. So it will be the moving of that equipment to the parking level that would allow the number of persons up to 165. And we've heard from the proponent, it was new information, I believe, to me this evening, that out of that 165, there are a portion that will be employees, and so they're not all paying patrons, and that there are limitations to the outdoor aspect of the seating. But I just wanted to provide that as clarification in terms of that 165. With regards to parking, we understand that whether we approve a variance amount or not, this proponent can go ahead and convert these 4 parking spaces based on the agreement they have with their landlord. And by making a decision on not granting any variance or some amount, that is not. I don't believe, from what I've heard this evening, I believe this proponent intends to move forward on this, given the investments that they have made in this, and that there's an indication whether, what the challenge will present. But it's not. Our decision does not impact. Whatever decision we make on this, it does not impact whether those spaces, I do not believe it will impact on those spaces not being used for the commercial business as proposed, and that I think we need to be careful, and colleagues have been tried to be careful in terms of terms of public. When the parking under the loading and parking bylaw, when mixed-use development parking requirement is calculated, it is calculated based on the number of tenants, 1 parking space per, and it is calculated based on the square footage of the commercial area. And so the parking requirement is arrived at. But as I have raised at a previous council meeting, in terms of, and we passed, a motion was passed that I requested come forward, was that we revisit under our loading and parking bylaw how parking spaces are apportioned, because after the calculation is made, how many residential spaces and how many commercial spaces, there is no imposition through our bylaws as to how those parking spaces are used. And that the strata or the development can go ahead and use them for residential use. They can go ahead and use them for commercial tenant use, whether it's their employees, or they would have to have approval from the strata or the developer, depending on the ownership, of whether they would be open to visitors to the residents, or whether they would be open to patrons of the businesses. My understanding, and I don't know that we've seen this in writing, but my understanding is that given the variance that was given to this development at the time of application, 34 spaces, 33 and then one later, a variance, is that the intention was that these parking spaces would be for residents and for commercial tenants, not for the customers of either, the visitors of residents or the customers of patrons. So just a clarification of what we term public. It's also been commented that there's a domino effect, that if these spaces aren't used, that it will wind up, spaces will be used elsewhere. The proponent indicated in the original letters submitted to us at the July 19th meeting that he is implementing mitigating factors and incentives to employees to use transportation other than vehicles. He also indicated, as Councillor Duncan reaffirmed this evening, that 2 parking spaces came with the commercial space, and that he had requested 2 additional spaces. So I've commented on the business case, on the seating. In terms of the foreseeable, again, that's not an issue for me, because he is willing to pay 10%. We can question due diligence, but the fact that he's willing to pay the $10,000 does not do that. In terms of the comment with regards to the consideration by our council of changes to the loading and parking bylaw and increasing the amount of the payment in lieu, I will grant that this council did have some discussion, and we did direct staff quite some time ago to consider it. But I have a question through to staff, and that is, and I don't recall what our first meeting was on the moving forward the amendments to the loading and parking bylaw. But in that staff report, was it a recommendation of staff to leave it at $10,000? And we amended it to become $20,000?
Yes, I believe I presented the draft bylaw to council in October of 2020. And at that time, staff were recommending that the amount stay the same. And I believe at that time there was a 25% cap. Council reduced that through resolution to 20% and increased the amount to, there was a suggestion that it should be increased, I believe, and staff brought back 15 and council subsequently changed it to 20,000.
Okay, so I don't, while discussion may have talked about the loading and parking bylaw, I don't think it was a certainty for the community, and it wasn't even a certainty for council until we passed the amending resolution to 20,000 that we were in fact going to increase it. So I don't know that this proponent or the business community at large could make an assumption on where the loading and parking bylaw was going. And in terms of being a precedent, I am supportive. A part of being supportive for this going to public for the comment, or to public for comment, is I'm supportive of this in the unique circumstance, and I don't believe it sets a precedent because of this unique circumstance. Is that at the time the business plan was being put together, the actual loading and parking fee was $10,000, and I think that is a reasonable case to put forward at this time, and I don't think that sets a precedent because we have passed the bylaw with the change, and going forward, it is $20,000. Those are my comments. I will turn to any second-time speakers before calling the question. Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Or sorry? Council? No, that's okay.
Sorry, just one clarification. I wasn't sure if there was a seconder on that original motion. There was?
Sorry, there is, no, there was no.
It just comes back on the table the way it was.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question, Councillor. Seeing no discussion, I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? We have 2 opposed, Councillor O'Keefe and Councillor Fallot. The motion carries. Thank you. With no other business, we move to adjournment. Motion to adjourn.
If I may,
Sure.
there's a second part to the staff report,
I'm sorry.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for that.
And for the purposes of discussion, I'm prepared to move that if the variance is approved, the town enter into an agreement with the applicant to the satisfaction of the Director of Corporate Services to allow the payment in lieu of parking fees, excuse me, to be paid in quarterly installments over a 24-month period.
Okay.
I'll second, and then I'll move that we table this until we're considering the variance. Like, we don't have to do this tonight.
Okay, so we have it moved and seconded, and a motion to table to the meeting when we're considering the variance application. A question, Councillor Garnett?
Yeah, I have a question for staff.
Certainly.
Just play into this. I understand the rationale you've used before earlier about that this could work sort of into a function, but I'm just really concerned about whether or not this could be construed as providing an individual business with an advantage and how that plays out.
Mr. Hisek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through to Councillor Garnett, we will certainly do our legal due diligence before this comes back. But the thing with variances, most of them are for a form of business, whether it's a development or some other business enterprise. So I guess the question here is really about the installments versus the variance amount.
Yeah.
We will do our due diligence.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. A question through you to staff, sort of in the same vein. So I guess what I'm worried about, again, is setting a precedent so that anybody who comes forward wanting pay in lieu, that will accept the same treatment.
Okay, sorry.
I get,
We have a motion to table on the floor, so we're not.
okay, so are we
we're not-
talking, I wasn't sure
we're
where,
not- we're not-
which motion,
If I
because
can-
we had a motion, it was seconded, and then so are we having discussion on that? Or are we having discussion on the tabling of the motion? Has that been seconded?
Okay, if I can clarify,
Okay.
Councillor. So we had the motion as read by Councillor Garnett, or by Councillor Rintoul. It was seconded by Councillor Wainwright. Normally, we would go to discussion
Okay,
on that, but Councillor Wainwright then made a motion to table. With the motion to table on the floor, we are not deliberating the motion, the aspects of the motion. We are, sorry?
There's no second.
I'm sorry. Do we have a seconder on the tabling motion?
Second.
Thank you. With the tabling motion on the floor, we're not debating the original motion. We are debating
Okay.
you can comment on whether you wish to table or not, and we will call the question on tabling, and we can carry on the discussion based on that, the outcome of that vote.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. Just to clarify, was the original motion as written in the staff report, so subject to approval, the installment plan would be approved?
I'll read it again. But you're correct. It reads that if the variance is approved, the town enter into an agreement with the applicant to the satisfaction of the Director of Corporate Services to allow the payment in lieu of parking fees to be paid in quarterly installments over a 24-month period.
oh,
Okay. So as it sits now, we would have to debate the issue of whether we allow the installments upon approval as opposed to now subject to approval. Is that council's intention?
I think council's intention is that the motion is tabled to the next meeting when we are considering the variance application based on the notices being returned. Councilor Wainwright?
Thank you, Mayor. On the merits of tabling, this would allow staff sufficient time to do the legal due diligence. And if they tell us we can't do this, then that would be good to know before we vote on it.
We wouldn't have to rescind the motion. Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Wainwright. Councilor Rintoul?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I appreciate the rationale being provided, because that was my first question. What's the rationale to table? because this feels a bit like deja vu. We've got something before us that we're putting off to another meeting, and this is exactly what we did at our last council meeting, and here we are at a special council meeting. And so this is the recommendation in the staff report. I'm assuming staff are comfortable with it, or it wouldn't be in the staff report. So I'll put that through to staff to comment on. But the only item that has been changed here in the original motion as put forward as a recommendation from staff is that the payments be quarterly and over 24 months. Quarterly because I think it's fair to the town to see a set repayment schedule, and over 24 months because the applicant expressed some concern with regard to having to do that, more so on the front end in the first 12 months of a startup business. So I view that as a scenario that's favorable both for the town as well as the applicant starting up the new business. So my query through to staff is the assumption, the rationale that we're tabling this to give staff time to become comfortable with this prospect. Please correct me if I'm wrong. You already are comfortable with it, or it wouldn't be in the report.
Through the chair to Councillor Rintoul, I'm afraid there was an assumption here that because we did it once, we could do it again, and that's probably not the kind of due diligence that should have gone into this. So I apologize for that, and we'll have it buttoned up by next meeting.
Thank you. So I'll support tabling on that basis, that I want the town to be putting its best foot forward in this discussion. But I will say, I'll restate that this is, I view it as unfortunate. We should be able to address this element tonight because it reads, if the variance is approved. And, that is to be determined. But it feels like for the applicant trying to start a new business, that this is another question mark hanging over their head. So I'm concerned about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul, and that leads me to a question through to staff. If the motion had been were to pass, that is, we did not table it, but we chose to pass it, would it appear in the notice to residents, or to where we're sending it?
That's a challenging one. I would see this as more of an administrative step as opposed to a legislative one, so probably not.
Okay. If it would not be incorporated in the notice, that I think I'm in favor of the tabling motion. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. The mayor anticipated one of my questions, but that it is an administrative step, and it's not really something the public needs to provide feedback on in the first place. About how we administer town fees is not something that the public needs to provide feedback on. But I appreciate Councillor Rintoul's point about delaying something once more, and I'm comfortable with it and seconded the motion because even if we approve this tonight, it doesn't move the applicant further forward. They still have to, they still come back on the same timeline, and so I don't feel that we're actually holding them back in any way by pushing this off. And if it was not approved at the next meeting, it was a moot point anyway. And I'm less concerned about what staff's comfort level was based on, knowing that they had done it before and that we can do it, and more that it would become a distraction around council's decision, that if councillors were not completely assured on the due diligence and that it was able to be done, that could become part of the discussion that didn't need to be there. And I am appreciative of Councillor Wainwright's initiative to make sure that got buttoned up, and that when we actually come back to it and we are discussing it, we really have all the facts on the table, and that can't be, it won't be part of an argument if it doesn't need to be. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I'll just echo the points. I'll support the tabling as well, and that's why I asked a question of staff. I just want to make sure that we're in the right space when we're making this kind of decision, and not having, find out later on that really, people could see that we're favoring one business over another, but for within our rights to do so, I think it's important that we have that nailed down. So thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question on tabling. All in favor? Opposed? We have 2 opposed, Councillor O'Keefe and Councillor Fallot, and the motion carries. We'll now move to a motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and second, all in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you.